The heavy brass keys dug into my palm, but the cold metal was not what made my chest tighten. A single blue thread had been tied in a messy double knot around the keyring. The scent of roasted prime rib and expensive vanilla cake hung thick in the Greyhaven Estate ballroom. Yet all I could smell was the sharp, sour tang of my own nervous sweat. The string quartet held a soft ceremonial chord beneath the silence, waiting for the staged key presentation to continue. 215 guests were dead silent, waiting. Adrian, my brand new son-in-law, stood under the crystal chandelier and thrust his manicured hand toward my chest. That practiced smile, the one he used for charity brochures, was fixed securely on his face for the 4 cameras circling us. "Hand them over, Raymond," Adrian said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. "You promised the foundation a legacy. We need the keys to Linden House. Right now." I was 67 years old, and I had spent 40 of those years running a disaster restoration business. Rebuilding homes after hurricanes and floods teaches you to recognize when a structure is about to collapse. Right now, I was watching my daughter's new marriage fall in on itself. Rachel stood beside her groom in a flowing white gown. She did not look at the cameras, and she did not look at her husband. Her eyes were fixed squarely on the blue thread resting in my hand. That thin piece of cotton did not belong on my keyring. I had left the brass ring completely clean on my bedroom dresser just a few hours ago. 28 years ago, an 8-year-old Rachel had tied a piece of blue yarn to her school backpack. We had established a secret code back then. If the babysitter was mean, and Rachel felt too scared to speak up, she would leave the blue string where I could easily find it. It was our private signal for extraction. I looked past the fake silver presentation key resting on a velvet tray nearby. Then I looked directly into my daughter's terrified eyes. "Blue thread, Rachel?" I asked, keeping my voice low enough that the microphones could not pick it up. "Are you asking me to get you out?" Rachel flinched, the color completely drained from her cheeks. Next to her stood Constance Cross, Adrian's mother and the founder of the charity. The older woman reached out with astonishing speed and gripped Rachel's wrist tightly, hiding the movement beneath the cascade of the bridal bouquet. Adrian quickly stepped into the narrow space between my daughter and me. "Do not ruin this," the groom whispered, dropping his public smile for a fraction of a second. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by a cold calculation. Then he raised his voice for the crowd. "Raymond, we are waiting for the keys to the $2 million property you pledged to the Home Again Foundation." "No," I said, and I tightened my fist around the brass ring. "Rachel needs to speak to me herself." Adrian lunged forward. He tried to snatch the keys right out of my hand. I pulled my arm back, acting purely on reflex, and my elbow caught the sharp edge of the cake table. Adrian did not step away to diffuse the tension. Instead, he swung his open hand and slapped me across the face with all his strength. The wet crack echoed through the cavernous ballroom. My hearing aid shrieked with a sudden burst of static, and my glasses skewed painfully down the bridge of my nose. A sharp, burning sting radiated across my cheekbone. My fingers went completely numb from the shock, and the keyring slipped out of my grasp, hitting the marble floor with a loud metallic crash. Rachel lurched forward, but she did not reach out to help her father. She slammed her white satin heel directly over the fallen keys, deliberately hiding the blue thread beneath her shoe. Before I could even reach up to steady my glasses, heavy hands grabbed my shoulders from behind. 4 men in identical black suits materialized out of the shadows by the catering doors. They moved far too fast, and with far too much coordination, for a spontaneous family altercation. "Get this man out of here," Adrian shouted, rubbing his own wrist as if I had been the one to attack him. "He is completely out of control. He just threatened my bride." The security guards yanked my arms backward, pinning them to my sides. I fought to keep my footing and looked at Rachel one last time. Her eyes were wide with a panic I had not seen since she was a child. Her pale lips barely moved as she whispered 2 words. "Please go." I could not tell if she was sending me away in shame or if she was begging me to escape something far worse. The guards marched me down the carpeted service hallway, and the heavy double doors swung shut behind us, permanently cutting off the shocked murmurs of the guests. They pushed me out through the loading dock and into the humid night air. A 5th guard stood by the exit holding a black plastic clipboard. As I walked past the young man, I caught a brief glimpse of the incident report. The paper was already filled out. Under the description section, someone had written a clear narrative about a confused elderly guest becoming violent. They had typed that report before the wedding ceremony even started. I stood alone in the empty parking lot. My jaw throbbed with a dull ache, and my chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. I did not go to my truck immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed Daniel Ortiz, the production manager I had hired to run the event. I had paid for everything today, which meant the vendor contract was in my name, not the foundation's. "Daniel," I said when the line connected, "there has been an assault. I want you to cut the music, turn off the screens, and kill the live stream. Right now." "Mr. Hale, are you sure?" Daniel asked, the panic clear in his trembling voice. "The entire donor board is watching. Turn it all off, Daniel, and lock down the raw footage. Nobody gets a single copy but me." I ended the call and stood leaning against my truck door, counting the seconds. 10 minutes later, the faint bass thumping from the ballroom stopped dead. The exterior lights flickered as the production crew pulled the plugs on the main feed. I did not feel victorious. I climbed into the driver's seat and drove away, leaving my daughter trapped inside the silence I had just created. My phone began buzzing frantically before I even reached the interstate highway. I ignored the calls and drove straight home. Linden House was a large stone and timber property that my late wife Helen and I had restored over decades, piece by piece. The house was supposed to be a quiet refuge tonight. Instead, my screen lit up with dozens of frantic text messages. I clicked on a social media link sent by one of my project managers. A video was already spreading online. It was a 15-second clip from the wedding, heavily and expertly edited. The footage only showed me pulling my arm back, making it look like I was winding up for a brutal punch, followed by the security guards dragging me away. Adrian was standing protectively in front of his new wife. The typed caption accused me of ruining a charity event for homeless women because I was too greedy to share my wealth. My phone vibrated in my palm again. It was Maya Brooks, my corporate attorney. "Raymond, do not post anything on the internet," Maya commanded the moment I answered. "Do not reply to any comments, and absolutely do not call your son-in-law." "They set me up, Maya," I said, walking up the front stone steps of my dark house. "That security team was waiting in the wings for me." "I believe you," the lawyer replied. "Her PT the evidence, PT the preserve every piece of evidence, but right now they are building a very specific narrative. We need to preserve every piece of evidence." "Have you checked the house?" "I am walking through the front door right now," I told her. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and flipped on the foyer lights. Everything looked perfectly untouched. But as I walked into the kitchen, a thick white envelope sat dead center on the granite island. It bore the gold Home Again Foundation logo stamped in the corner. I set my phone on speaker, placed it on the counter, and ripped the paper open. It was a formal thank you letter, acknowledging my irrevocable pledge to donate Linden House to the charity. The date printed at the top was from 3 weeks ago. I had never signed any such document. "Maya," I said, staring hard at the crisp paper. "They left a fake donation pledge on my counter. Someone from the foundation was in my house. Touch it as little as possible," Maya instructed immediately. "I will be there tomorrow morning to collect it." I ended the call. The silence of the empty house felt suddenly suffocating. I needed to know what the blue thread really meant. Rachel had clearly left it for me as a message, but how had she gotten it onto my keys? I walked down the main hallway toward the back of the property. I stopped in front of Helen's home office. I had kept the door firmly locked for 3 years, ever since the cancer finally took her. I simply had not been able to face the boxes of her old files or the lingering scent of her perfume. I took a deep breath, inserted my spare key, and turned the lock. The door clicked open with a stiff groan. The room smelled exactly like her. An overwhelming mix of cedar wood, old paper, and a faint hint of lavender. The familiar scent made my throat ache, but I forced myself to step inside and turn on the brass desk lamp. Helen used to volunteer for the Home Again Foundation before she got sick. If Rachel was in serious trouble with them, the answer might be buried somewhere in this room. I walked over to the wooden sewing box Helen always kept neatly on the bookshelf. I opened the hinged lid. The spools of thread were perfectly arranged by color, just the way she had left them. The specific slot where the blue spool belonged was completely empty. Rachel had been in this room. I looked down at Helen's desk. Her old leather-bound recipe book sat near the edge of the blotter. It was not supposed to be there, because Helen had always kept that specific book in the kitchen pantry. I opened the heavy cover and flipped slowly through the handwritten pages. Halfway through the book, a single page had been torn out so forcefully that the jagged edges of the paper still stuck out from the binding. A sharp noise broke the quiet of the house. I froze. The sound came from the kitchen, just down the hall. It was a metallic scraping, deliberate and agonizingly slow. Someone was testing the lock on the back door. I quickly switched off the desk lamp, plunging the office back into total darkness. I stood perfectly still, listening to the heavy brass handle of the exterior door rattle. They had not come into my house for jewelry, or for cash, or for the keys to the front door. They had come for Helen's room, and they were trying to get inside right now. The brass handle on the back door rattled. The metal groaned against the deadbolt, echoing down the dark hallway. I did not yell out, and I did not grab a weapon. Decades of assessing unstable structures had taught me to observe stress points before rushing in. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. While the police dispatcher picked up, I opened my home security application and hit the exterior floodlight toggle. The backyard instantly bathed in harsh white light. Heavy boots scrambled against the wooden planks of the deck. By the time I reached the window, a shadow was sprinting across the lawn toward a sport utility vehicle idling on the street. The driver wore a thick black windbreaker with a reflective logo across the shoulder blades, the exact emblem used by one of the event vendors at Greyhaven Estate. The heavy engine roared, and the truck sped away into the humid night air. 2 officers arrived 15 minutes later. They inspected the back door with a flashlight, pointing out deep scratches around the keyhole where someone had tried to force a tension wrench. The older officer took my statement, categorizing the event as a standard attempted burglary for loose cash or jewelry. I thanked him and locked the solid oak door. The police had no reason to know the truth, but I did. Ordinary burglars do not target a locked interior office door while the rest of a $2 million house sits completely empty. The next morning, Maya Brooks's law office smelled of expensive, dark roast coffee. She sat across from me in a tailored gray suit, reviewing the physical evidence I had collected. She placed the fake donation pledge inside a plastic protective sleeve. Handing over keys does not transfer property ownership, the lawyer explained, her voice calm and devoid of panic. And a viral video of you pulling your arm back does not create a binding legal deed. However, the Home Again Foundation is building a pretext for the public. Maya leaned forward, tapping her fingernail against the plastic sleeve. They will use this forged pledge to file a civil suit. That lawsuit allows them to place a hold on your title, freezing the property while the court sorts out the dispute. We need a strict evidence log starting right now. You cannot try to guess Rachel's passwords. You cannot record anyone without explicit consent. And you absolutely will not post a single word on the internet to defend yourself. I handed her the photograph of the incident report. Maya nodded, pulling out a fresh legal pad. I am sending preservation notices to Greyhaven, the production company, and the foundation, she said, writing quickly. We need to secure the raw footage before someone accidentally deletes the only proof you have. Daniel Ortiz looked physically sick when he unlocked his studio 2 hours later. The small editing bay hummed with the sound of cooling fans. Daniel sat at his control console and brought up the master file from the wedding ceremony. Someone from the foundation called me at 2 in the morning, Daniel said, keeping his eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. A woman demanded the raw storage drives. I told her the contract was in your name and hung up. I locked the files behind a physical firewall right after the call ended. He pressed play. Unedited footage from the center camera filled the large screen, clearly showing Adrian lunging at me, attempting to snatch the brass keys, and delivering the open-handed strike. My defensive flinch happened a full second later. The viral clip had conveniently cut out Adrian's entire attack. Isolate the audio tracks, I instructed. Find the microphones on the catering staff and the security team. Daniel clicked a series of buttons. A backstage audio track hissed through the studio speakers. Constance Cross's sharp, elegant voice cut through the static, speaking to a staff member right before the ceremony began. Is the house shot framed? The older woman asked. Daniel switched to another track. This one captured Adrian standing near the service doors, speaking in a hushed tone to the head of the security team. If he refuses, remove him before he turns this into a scene, the groom ordered. The public humiliation had been fully choreographed. I sat in the cab of my truck outside the studio, staring at my phone. I dialed my daughter's number, desperately needing to hear her voice. The line rang 3 times before someone picked up. "We are filing suit on Monday, Raymond," Adrian said. His tone was perfectly smooth, completely different from the violent man I had just watched on the tape. "You broke a charitable pledge in front of the entire donor board. Put Rachel on the phone," I demanded, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "My wife is resting," he replied. "She is devastated by your behavior. Dad, do not touch Mom's recipes." Rachel's voice drifted through the receiver, distant and muffled, as if she were speaking from across a large room. It sounded like a random statement, the kind of nonsense someone might say in a panic. Adrian immediately covered the microphone, producing a heavy scratching noise. When the line cleared, Constance was speaking. "Raymond, we only want to keep Helen's legacy alive. Please, stop fighting us." The call disconnected. I stared at the dark screen. Rachel had not been making small talk about baking. She had been giving me an explicit instruction hidden beneath a layer of domestic banality. The kitchen of Linden House felt massive and entirely too empty. I set Helen's old leather-bound recipe book on the granite island and opened it to the first page. For years, I had assumed it was just a collection of baking instructions she had gathered from church friends. Now, I looked much closer. The handwriting was definitely my late wife's, but the measurements made absolutely no logical sense. One recipe for a simple pound cake called for 4,000 cups of flour. Instead of vanilla extract, she had written a specific date from 10 years ago. Next to the baking temperature, there was a strange sequence of letters and numbers. I recognized the pattern immediately. When Helen helped manage the restoration business, she used a specific shorthand to link paper files to digital project codes. She had adapted that exact system right here on the page. I flipped to a recipe titled Blueberry Winter. The ingredients listed a specific land parcel number and a county transfer date. I opened my laptop and logged into the Public Property Records database for Fairfield County. I typed the parcel number into the search bar. The screen loaded a property history for a small residential home in Bridgeport. The original owner was listed as Nora Price. 14 months ago, the title had transferred to a corporate entity called Blue Winter Holdings, Limited Liability Company. I cross-referenced the business registry for that corporate name. The registered address was a shared post office box in a neighboring town, the exact mailing address used by the secondary security vendor from the wedding. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as I walked back into Helen's locked office. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my shoulders as I approached her wooden filing cabinet. I pulled the bottom drawer open, expecting to find her old tax returns. Instead, a rectangular gap sat squarely between the hanging folders. The surrounding files were covered in a fine layer of dust, but the empty space was perfectly clean. Someone had removed a thick file box very recently. I checked the index tab on the folder directly behind the gap. It read Blue Winter. They had taken the physical documents before the wedding ceremony even started. I knelt on the floor, shining my phone flashlight into the back of the empty drawer. A small piece of torn notebook paper had slipped loose and wedged itself beneath the metal sliding track. I reached in and carefully pulled it out. Helen's sharp, cursive script filled the small scrap of paper. Nora did not donate. She was cornered. My chest tightened. The woman I had loved for 4 decades had known about a stolen house, and she had hidden the terrible truth inside a recipe book. My phone buzzed in my pocket, displaying a fresh alert from the exterior camera system. A dark sport utility vehicle had just driven past my driveway without turning on its headlights. The camera caught a blurry image of the license plate. The numbers matched the secondary security company Adrian had hired for the ceremony. They had not come into my house for jewelry, cash, or the keys. They had come for Helen's room. Rain beat heavily against the windshield of my truck. Bridgeport looked gray and unforgiving through the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. Maya had traced the property records to a small rental apartment on the east side of the city, but Nora Price had flatly refused to speak with a lawyer over the phone. I parked by the cracked curb, zipped my canvas jacket against the damp chill, and walked up the concrete stairs alone. A woman in her early 60s opened the door just a few inches. Her dark eyes were sharp, scanning my face before landing on the embroidered company logo on my jacket. I introduced myself as Helen Hale's husband. The brass chain lock slid open immediately, scraping loudly against the metal plate. Cardboard boxes stacked 3 feet high dominated the tiny living room. Brown packing tape held them shut, a clear sign the occupant had not accepted her new reality. The air smelled intensely of stale coffee and damp wool. Nora offered me a plastic folding chair, the only seating available in the entire room. She spoke quietly, telling me how the Home Again Foundation had arrived like a miracle when she fell behind on her property taxes after her husband died. They promised to cover the delinquent debt and keep her in her home. She signed a document labeled as a temporary stewardship agreement. 6 weeks later, a moving crew showed up with an eviction notice. The property had been transferred to Blue Winter Holdings, refinanced against its equity, and sold for cash to a developer. The shame burned hot in my chest. My late wife's foundation had stripped this woman of her dignity and her sanctuary. Nora walked over to a stack of heavy boxes and retrieved a digital tablet. She tapped the cracked glass screen twice, bringing up a promotional video from the charity website. The bright, high-definition footage showed Nora standing on her old front porch, looking incredibly relieved. Rachel stood right beside her, wrapping a supportive arm around the older woman's narrow shoulders. My daughter looked directly into the camera lens and promised that Nora would never be pushed out of her neighborhood. "Look at your girl," Nora said quietly, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing screen. "Watch her eyes." I leaned closer and watched the footage loop again. Rachel looked remarkably tense. Her bright smile appeared stiff, forced at the corners, and she kept darting nervous glances just off camera, right to where Adrian would have been standing to direct the promotional shoot. The video was still actively generating donations on their homepage, long after Nora had surrendered her keys. Nora reached into her cardigan pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to me. It was a physical copy of the initial intake form. My daughter's signature sat neatly on the witness line, officially identifying her as the program coordinator. A faint floral scent drifted up from the woolen scarf draped over the cardboard box next to my chair. The smell of lavender and cedar perfectly matched Helen's favorite perfume. A sudden memory hit me, sharp and entirely unwelcome. 1 year before the cancer diagnosis, Helen had stood in our kitchen holding a thick stack of manila folders. She asked me a hypothetical question about commercial property law. Could helping someone keep their mortgage become a legal mechanism for taking the title away? I had been exhausted from managing a massive hurricane recovery project in Florida. I dismissed her concern immediately, telling her to take any serious worries directly to the foundation board. I had completely ignored the warning signs when she needed me to listen. I left Nora's apartment and sat in the cold cab of my truck. Pulling out my phone, I accessed Helen's archived email account. I searched the inbox for Nora Price. A single draft message appeared, addressed directly to Constance Cross. The subject line simply read, "Nora Price closing." The entire body of the email had been permanently deleted. Someone had scrubbed the details, but the digital silence itself was a blaring alarm. The professional fallout reached my corporate office by 8 o'clock the next morning. My operations manager met me in the main hallway, holding a formal cancellation notice from our largest commercial client. The viral wedding video had done its job perfectly. Adrian had escalated his media campaign, appearing on a local morning television broadcast. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every inch the concerned, compassionate son. "Raymond Hale has always resented our charitable work," Adrian told the sympathetic television host, projecting a tone of deep sadness. "He is trying to destroy this foundation because he cannot control his daughter's choices." The studio screen flashed several candid photographs of me signing the vendor checks for the wedding. Adrian used my financial support to paint me as a wealthy, erratic man who used his checkbook to manipulate his family. Constance sat next to him on the studio couch, her hands clasped softly in her lap. She declared to the camera that the foundation would protect the brave bride from any financial retaliation. My staff begged me to release the raw camera footage immediately to clear our corporate name. Maya Brooks shut the idea down during a frantic conference call. Releasing the unedited tape now would tip our hand, giving Adrian valuable time to invent a new lie. Reputation had to take a back seat to legal strategy. Forensic accountant Leo Martin, operated out of a windowless office downtown. Spread across his massive mahogany conference table were 4 complex financial charts. Leo pulled a stack of bank routing slips from his leather briefcase. He laid them out next to the charts, creating a clear visual map of the theft. He did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He pointed a red felt pen at the blue Winter Holdings box on the thick paper. "I traced the registered agent for this shell company," Leo explained, his voice low and incredibly fast. "It matches 3 other corporate entities perfectly. They all share the exact same post office box." He walked me through the brutal, systematic math. Each separate company had absorbed a residential property from a vulnerable family seeking help from the foundation. Within a matter of weeks, every single house was leveraged for maximum cash through a rapid commercial refinance. The money never returned to the charity operating accounts. Instead, a massive portion of the funds flowed directly into a media consulting firm exclusively controlled by Adrian. We finally had the solid money trail for the Sun, but Constance remained legally invisible. Her name did not appear on any of the corporate incorporation documents. The true architect of the machine was staying completely in the shadows, letting others take the risk. The gray storm clouds finally broke just before sunset. I sat across from Maya in her high-rise office, watching the distant city lights flicker to life through the rain-streaked glass. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the space. The lawyer slid a thick manila envelope across her polished desk. It was the certified deed package for Nora Price, obtained directly from the county recorder. "You need to look closely at page 42, Maya said, her tone completely devoid of any comfort. I turned the heavy paper pages. The final declaration sheet confirmed that the homeowner understood the transfer and surrendered all legal rights to the property voluntarily. The electronic signature at the bottom did not belong to Adrian, and it certainly did not belong to Constance. Her account might have been compromised, I said immediately, the words rushing out in a desperate, automatic defense of my child. Someone could have easily used her login credentials. Maya folded her hands together, resting them on the desk. The electronic signature audit trail confirms the document was completed directly from Rachel's personal account. We cannot blindly assume she is an innocent victim here, Raymond. We have to follow the paper, no matter where it leads. The attorney reached over and flipped to the final printed appendix of the package. An email exchange between the closing agent and the foundation sat in stark black and white. The sender address belonged exclusively to my daughter. The message was just 1 sentence long, but it carried the devastating weight of a guilty verdict. Proceed before she changes her mind. I stared at the letters until the ink blurred together on the page. At the bottom of the document was the signature I had taught her to write when she was a little girl, Rachel Hale. My daughter had certified the lie. 3 days after meeting Nora Price in that damp apartment, a stranger walked up my driveway. The man wore a faded blue polo shirt and carried a thick stack of legal-sized papers. He handed the heavy bundle directly to me while I was checking the mailbox, mumbled a quick confirmation of my identity, and walked away. The front page bore the seal of the county civil court. The Home Again Foundation was officially suing me. I spread the documents across my kitchen island. The lawsuit formally accused me of violating a written, charitable pledge and causing severe financial damage to their donor campaign. Attached to the complaint was a crisp, perfect reproduction of a donation agreement. It promised the immediate transfer of Linden House to the charity on the day of my daughter's wedding. At the very bottom of the final page, my electronic signature sat perfectly centered on the dotted line. My chest tightened. I had never seen this document before in my life. Maya Brooks arrived an hour later, bringing her own scanner and a fresh legal pad. She reviewed the court filing with total detachment. "They are asking the judge for a temporary injunction," the attorney explained, tapping her pen against the printed signature. "This is not going to hand them the property today, but it does create a lis pendens on your title. That is a formal notice of a pending legal dispute. You will not be able to sell the house, transfer the deed, or borrow a single dollar against your equity until this case is resolved." Anger flared hot in my throat. I pulled my phone from my pocket, ready to dial Rachel's number and demand an explanation for the forgery. Maya reached out and pressed her hand firmly over the phone screen. "Do not call her, Raymond. Do not alert the person who currently controls the digital data. The fallout continued spreading outward, hitting my business before noon. I stood at the head of the long mahogany conference table at Hale Restoration. My regional managers refused to meet my eyes. 2 more major corporate clients had just paused their contracts, citing the negative press from the viral wedding video. My chief operating officer shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. He had known Rachel since she was a teenager. "Mr. Hale," he started slowly, his voice hesitant. "Rachel came by the office about 4 months ago to drop off some paperwork for you. She was talking to the administrative staff in the break room. She told everyone that Linden House was going to become a legacy shelter for the foundation after the wedding. She made it sound like a done deal." The air in the boardroom grew perfectly still. The narrative had not been a sudden improvisation by a greedy son-in-law. The story had been carefully planted, watered, and cultivated for months by my own child. I looked around the room at the people who relied on this company to feed their families. I would not let my personal nightmare destroy their livelihoods. I formally handed the daily operations over to my chief operating officer for a period of 30 days. It was not a surrender. It was a tactical retreat to protect my crew. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I sat in Maya's downtown office. She had received a massive preservation response from the independent wedding planner. The digital file contained the detailed briefing packets sent to the secondary security team. Maya turned her monitor so I could read the screen. A crisp color photograph of my face stared back at me. Below the picture, the text listed my exact age and a chilling behavioral warning. The document advised guards to prepare for a possible cognitive or emotional escalation from the father of the bride. It included strict instructions to physically remove me from the venue if I refused to participate in the key ceremony. "Look at the creation date," Maya said softly. The file had been generated 11 days before the wedding ceremony. The sender was listed as the program events email account, a profile exclusively assigned to Rachel. The attached incident report template was completely filled out, using the exact phrases Adrian had shouted at the cameras when I dropped the keys. "This proves premeditation for a public humiliation," Maya noted, typing rapidly on her own keyboard. "It proves they planned to drag you out, but it does not explicitly prove real estate fraud." I needed something stronger. The silver prop key Adrian had demanded on the stage had bothered me for days. We found the invoice in the wedding planner's discovery files and drove straight to the fabrication workshop that afternoon. The shop owner was a tired-looking man wearing a heavy leather apron. He pulled up the original work order on his dusty computer terminal. The foundation had not ordered just one ceremonial key. They had purchased 12 identical brass and silver props for a project labeled as Legacy Home Ceremonies. 3 of those exact keys had already been used in promotional videos featuring other displaced families. The groom requested the custom logo engraving, the shop owner explained, squinting at the screen. An older woman named Constance explicitly demanded that we leave all specific property addresses off the metal. But the daughter was the one who actually signed the purchase order. The owner wiped his calloused hands on a rag. She asked me a strange question when she picked them up. The bride wanted to know if a ceremonial key exchange could happen in public without the homeowner actually signing the deed on the spot. I told her I just make the props. I do not handle the paperwork. That question echoed in my mind all the way back to the truck. Was Rachel actively helping to build the trap, or was she desperately searching for a structural flaw in their plan? I unlocked the truck door and climbed into the driver's seat. Before I could turn the ignition, my phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "Do not fight the pledge in public. Check who created it." Attached to the message was a blurry photograph of a laptop screen, displaying the forged donation pledge. The angle was tight. No hands or faces were visible in the frame, just the glowing monitor and the edge of a white desk. I quickly typed a 2-word response. "Blue thread?" I waited. The cursor blinked on the screen. No reply came. 60 seconds later, the messaging application flashed a warning, and the text vanished completely. The sender had used an auto-delete function. Fortunately, my decades of documenting structural damage meant my reflexes were fast. I had already taken a screenshot of the image and saved the digital metadata. "Someone is throwing bait," Maya warned from the passenger seat. "They want you to reach out, or they want you to try hacking the foundation system illegally. We do this the right way." The right way meant hiring an independent data forensics expert. We sat in a sterile, climate-controlled server room the next morning. The technician projected the electronic signature audit trail onto the white wall. The digital certificate for the donor pledge is completely valid, the technician explained, pointing a green laser at the scrolling code. Your signature was digitally lifted from the original catering contract you signed 12 months ago. But the pledge document itself was created and uploaded from a laptop registered to Rachel Hale. I stared at my daughter's name shining on the wall. The timing is the most critical part, the expert continued. The file was finalized and the electronic signature was applied, while the bridal party was on site at Greyhaven Estate for the wedding rehearsal. Accessing that specific document required multi-factor authentication. The laser pointer moved to a new line of data. The system sent a 6-digit security code to Rachel's personal cell phone. The audit log confirms that the exact code was manually typed into the laptop 60 seconds later. My breathing turned shallow. Adrian could have easily held her phone. He could have stolen it from her purse. Can you track the physical location of the phone during that minute? I asked. The technician brought up a device access log. The phone was actively moving. It pinged a local wireless router in the main bridal suite, then moved down the hall and reconnected to the router located inside the private fitting room. The technical data could not tell me who was actually holding the device. It could not tell me if my daughter had willingly read the security code out loud, or if a violent man had backed her into a corner and forced her to unlock the screen. The terrifying question of coercion remained completely unanswered. Then the expert opened the document history file. Before it was converted to a secure format, the original word processing file had a different title. The technician noted quietly. The text on the wall shifted. The original file name read, Raymond Hale Pledge Final RH Approved. I looked at the author metadata listed right below the title. It simply read, R. Hale. I felt cold. The letters did not stand for Raymond Hale. I had never used that specific naming convention for any of my contracts. My daughter, however, used it every single day for her charity event files. The forged pledge had not come from Adrian's computer. It had come from Rachel's. The anonymous text message arrived just past midnight, containing only an address and a time. 6 o'clock in the morning at a small stone church on the eastern edge of town. Helen used to arrange white lilies in that exact sanctuary every Sunday. The familiarity of the location felt like a deliberate manipulation. Maya Brooks knew about the secret meeting, but stayed sitting in her parked sedan a full block away. The lawyer had explicitly warned me not to promise my daughter any legal immunity. I sat alone in the third pew. The sanctuary smelled of old pine polish and damp wool. Outside, a steady rain drummed against the stained glass windows. The heavy oak doors creaked open, the sound echoing sharply off the vaulted ceiling. Rachel stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously toward the empty choir loft before she checked the street through the glass. She wore an oversized gray sweater, clutching a cheap plastic burner phone tightly against her chest. Her left hand gripped the wooden edge of the last pew. The massive diamond engagement ring was completely gone. I did not stand up to hug her. The paternal instinct to protect fought a brutal war against the cold facts of the evidence. Instead of reaching out, I pulled the brass keyring from my coat pocket and placed the knotted blue thread on the polished wood between us. Rachel stared at the cotton string. She walked slowly down the aisle, reached out with a trembling hand, and touched the frayed edge. I used the old house key. You never asked me to return, she whispered. 2 nights before the wedding, I went into Mom's office, took the blue spool, and moved her recipe book onto the desk because I needed you to find it. On the wedding day, when you set your keyring beside Mom's keepsake box in the bridal suite, I tied the thread while the stylists fixed my veil. Then I slipped the keys back into your coat pocket. Relief washed over me, immediately followed by a cold wave of suspicion. Why wait for the wedding ceremony? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. You had 14 months to tell me. She sat down heavily on the bench, leaving 2 full feet of empty space between us. Adrian needed the public handover. The foundation board required visual proof of your massive donation to secure their next round of commercial banking credit. He built the entire ceremony to trap you in front of the cameras. She looked down at her bare hands, tracing the pale line where her ring used to sit. But I needed the trap just as much as he did. I knew you would never hand over those keys if they ambushed you in front of 200 people. You always protect your property. Rachel had deliberately let me walk onto that stage. She had used my predictable stubbornness to sabotage her own husband's transaction. You wanted me to cause a scene, I said, realizing the depth of her cold calculation. I wanted the transfer permanently delayed, she corrected, finally meeting my eyes. And I made sure your production company handled the independent recording contracts. I knew Adrian would immediately try to confiscate the footage when things went wrong. I needed the cameras rolling, and I needed you to exclusively own the raw tapes. She had weaponized my public humiliation to secure a digital record. The sheer pragmatism of the move was staggering. The sanctuary felt suddenly freezing. You could have just walked away, Rachel. You did not have to forge a legal pledge on your laptop. My daughter pulled her knees up to her chest. The defensive posture belonged to the terrified little girl I remembered, but the woman sitting next to me was deeply entangled in a massive real estate fraud. I did not type that pledge, she said. Adrian monitors my physical location through a shared cellular family account. He controls our joint banking passwords. 2 weeks ago, I found a draft memorandum in Constance's private email outbox. Rachel pulled a folded piece of paper from her sweater pocket and slid it across the pew. It was a formal memo addressed to the charity board of directors. Constance had written a highly detailed narrative, accusing Rachel of secretly creating rogue, corporate entities to siphon foundation money. The mother-in-law was actively preparing to destroy her. During my final dress fitting at Greyhaven, Rachel continued, her breathing growing shallow and fast. Adrian walked into the private dressing room, carrying my laptop. He took my cell phone right out of my purse, opened the pledge he had already drafted under my account, and uploaded it from my computer. Then he showed me this printed memo. I remembered the data log from the forensics expert, the phone moving down the hall, the 60-second gap, the security code, I said, the realization settling heavily in my gut. He made you read the authentication numbers. Rachel nodded, a single tear spilling down her pale cheek. He threatened to send the memo directly to the state prosecutor right then and there. He held the glowing screen in my face and told me to read the 6 digits out loud. I gave him the code. Dad, I gave it to him to buy myself some time. You gave him the code to save yourself, I thought. But you also gave them Nora Price. I reached into my jacket for the second time. I placed the certified county deed package right next to the blue thread. The heavy document bore the signature of Nora Price, effectively signing away her home forever. At the bottom of the final page, Rachel's electronic signature stood out in stark black ink. My daughter looked at the paper, and the remaining color completely drained from her face. I just signed the final page as a witness, she pleaded, her voice cracking under the pressure. Adrian brought it to me right after we shot the promotional video on her porch. I did not read the commercial property attachments. I turned to the final appendix and pointed to the printed email. You told the closing agent to proceed before the homeowner changed her mind. You wrote those exact words. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. Her hands shook violently against her knees. Adrian told me Nora had hired an independent lawyer. He swore the title transfer was only a temporary trust hold to satisfy the delinquent tax board. When Nora started asking questions, Adrian warned me that any delay would cost the foundation its emergency funding. He said other families would end up on the street if I held up the paperwork. Did you ever go back to check on Nora? I asked. The silence in the church stretched out for a full minute. The sound of the rain hitting the roof seemed incredibly loud. Rachel slowly shook her head. My chest physically ached, watching my only child confront the brutal reality of her choices. You were afraid of what they might do to your reputation, I told her, the words tasting like ash in my dry mouth. But Nora was already living with what all of you had done to her. Rachel sat up straight, swiping roughly at her wet cheeks. Her fear morphed into something harder, something that looked entirely too much like Constance Cross. I brought everything, she said, pulling a small silver memory drive from her pocket. Internal text messages, Adrian's bank routing numbers, the original scapegoat memo. It is enough to put both of them in federal prison for a decade. She held the small device tightly in her fist. I will give this to Maya right now, but you have to keep my name out of the active investigation. Do not hand the Nora Price deed to the investigators. We tell them Adrian forged my signature on everything. She wanted a private deal. She wanted me to lie to the authorities to erase her complicity. I cannot do that, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I will tell the absolute truth about how they controlled your accounts. I will testify about the threats and the dressing room ambush, but I will not hide what you actually signed. Rachel stood up, her sneakers squeaking harshly against the polished stone floor. You are choosing a stranger over your own family, she accused, her voice rising toward a desperate shout. You always did this. You always chose your restoration sites and your clients over being home with me. The accusation hit exactly where she intended. I had spent years trying to buy her forgiveness with expensive gifts and lavish wedding budgets. I almost reached out to take the drive and agree to her corrupt terms. The urge to fix everything for her was a powerful, toxic habit. Then I remembered the stacks of cardboard boxes in Nora's damp apartment. I stayed seated. We stared at each other across the wooden pew. The distance between us felt impossible to bridge. Rachel finally realized I was not going to rescue her this time. The anger slowly drained out of her posture, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. She dropped the silver memory drive onto the bench next to the blue thread. Before she turned to leave, she reached into her sweater one last time and pulled out a faded square photograph. I found this hidden in Constance's personal filing cabinet, Rachel said, her voice dropping back to a flat whisper. I thought you should have it before the police tear their office apart. She turned and walked down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy oak doors without looking back. I picked up the old photograph. The image showed Constance Cross standing on a cracked sidewalk in front of a small residential house. A wooden sign planted in the front yard read "Home Saved." Standing right next to Constance, smiling brightly for the camera, was my late wife. Behind the two women stood the original homeowner. I recognized the address instantly. It was the exact property linked to the blueberry winter recipe code in Helen's book. I turned the glossy photograph over. On the back, written in Helen's unmistakable cursive handwriting, were 5 words that changed the dead as much as the living. I signed the first release. The faded photograph burned a hole in my pocket all the way to Leo Martin's office the next morning. I placed the picture flat on the polished mahogany table and pointed to the address visible behind my late wife. The forensic accountant typed the street name into his property database. Within 10 minutes, Leo uncovered the original blueprint of the charity. 10 years ago, the foundation actually operated a legal rescue program. The charity held temporary management of distressed mortgages without ever taking the property title. Leo pulled up a scanned document from the county archives. Helen had signed a legitimate board release, authorizing emergency funds to save that specific house from foreclosure. This was a clean transaction, Leo explained, tapping his pen against the screen. Your wife approved a financial lifeline, but Constance Cross took this exact paperwork and slowly mutated it. The accountant opened a secondary file next to the first one. 3 years after Helen signed that initial release, Constance altered the standard closing package. The founder quietly inserted a warranty deed transfer into the massive stack of papers. To bypass board scrutiny, Constance simply copied Helen's original electronic signature and pasted it onto dozens of new corporate resolutions long after my wife had stepped back from daily operations. Helen had not stolen anything, but her good name provided the perfect camouflage. We needed someone from inside the accounting department to authenticate the forgery. Leo tracked down a former foundation bookkeeper named Calvin Reed. The diner near the commuter train station smelled of old frying oil and stale coffee. Calvin sat in the corner booth, keeping his back firmly pressed against the vinyl seat. The accountant's eyes darted constantly toward the glass doors. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and clutched his ceramic mug with trembling hands. Every transaction went through corporate counsel, Calvin stammered before I even pulled out a chair. I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement when I left. If I talk to you, they will ruin my life and send me to prison. Helen Hale never intended to hurt those families, I told him, keeping my voice low and steady. Calvin flinched violently at the sound of her name. He slammed his coffee mug down on the formica table. Dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the paper napkins. Your wife waited entirely too long to ask the right questions, Calvin snapped, his voice tight with suppressed panic. She knew the numbers stopped making sense, and she stayed quiet because she did not want a scandal. The former bookkeeper slid out of the booth and walked rapidly toward the exit. He did not look back, but he left his crumpled diner receipt sitting next to his spilled coffee. I picked up the damp slip of paper. Written across the back in blue ink was a specific unit number and a single word: off-site. The battle for my own property began in a sterile municipal courtroom 2 days later. The emergency civil hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. The attorney representing the Home Again Foundation presented the forged donor pledge and a sworn affidavit Rachel had signed a month before the wedding, stating her father planned to surrender the house. Maya Brooks countered immediately. My lawyer submitted my sworn statement, the certified title record, and the forensic report proving the electronic signature was lifted from a catering contract. The judge peered down from the wooden bench, clearly irritated by the chaotic family dispute. The magistrate refused to grant the foundation immediate possession of Linden House. However, the court maintained a temporary freezing order to prevent either side from altering the property status during the forensic review. I retained my physical keys, but I could not legally sell the house, borrow against the equity, or transfer the deed. My private sanctuary was now an active legal battlefield. That evening, the heavy humidity broke into a slow, rolling thunderstorm. I stood by the front window of Linden House, watching rain wash over the stone driveway. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Constance Cross stepped out of the passenger side and walked up the slate path, stopping exactly 1 foot short of my front porch. She knew exactly where the security camera sightlines ended. I opened the heavy front door but kept the deadbolt engaged, speaking through the narrow gap. "Rachel is just as fragile as her mother was," Constance said smoothly, raising an expensive black umbrella against the rain. "If you drag these old files into an open court, your daughter will collapse under the pressure of a federal investigation." "You forced her to read an authentication code under threat," I replied, feeling the familiar anger tighten my chest. "I merely guided her toward the right decision for the charity," the older woman countered, offering a practiced smile. "I will drop the civil lawsuit tomorrow morning. I will let your daughter return to you without any professional consequences. All you have to do is hand over Helen's recipe book and the remaining boxes in her office." I studied the woman standing in the rain. She did not want the house. She wanted the index. "Why would a billionaire care about a book of baking measurements?" I asked. For a fraction of a second, the perfect composure vanished. Constance gripped the handle of her umbrella so hard, her knuckles turned stark white. Her jaw tightened, revealing a flash of genuine panic before the polite mask slid back into place. She turned sharply and walked back to her waiting car without another word. The receipt Calvin left on the diner table led Maya and me to a climate-controlled storage facility just across the county line. Because my name remained on Helen's estate executor documents, the facility manager legally granted us access to the unit. The metal door rolled upward with a deafening rattle. Inside the concrete room sat a dozen plastic bins filled with my late wife's personal charity records. We spent 3 hours sorting through the damp-smelling paperwork. Maya carefully photographed every single page to preserve the chain of evidence. I found a thick manila folder labeled with Rachel's name. The creation date stamped on the tab was 2 full years before my daughter ever took a job at the foundation. Helen had actively investigated the corporate structure, fearing the program would eventually pull Rachel into a dangerous orbit. Tucked inside the folder was a handwritten memo. Helen had documented a private conversation with Constance regarding the massive stacks of legal paperwork given to desperate homeowners. "Constance says no one reads the attachments when they are terrified of losing everything," my wife had written. Beneath the memo lay a heavy plastic bag containing a very old digital audio recorder. The battery was completely dead, and the charging port was coated in a thin layer of dust. I placed the small device in my pocket, alongside a stack of formal board releases. Maya held up one of the printed pages, pointing to a signature line at the bottom. "This is Helen's genuine signature," the attorney noted, tracing the blue ink. This document authorized the foundation to open their very first independent escrow account. It was not a deed transfer, but it built the financial infrastructure Constance needed to hide the stolen equity. I drove back to Linden House in complete silence. The kitchen felt colder than usual. I found a compatible charging cable in my desk drawer and plugged the old audio recorder into the wall. A tiny red light flickered on. After 10 minutes, the digital screen illuminated. There was only one saved file on the internal memory drive. I pressed play and sat alone in the dark kitchen. Helen's voice filled the empty room, sounding tired and incredibly frightened. The recording was a private audio diary entry made during her final months of cancer treatment. "I need more solid proof before I go to the authorities," my wife said, her breath catching softly on the microphone. "If I report the irregularities right now, the entire foundation will collapse. Hundreds of innocent families rely on our legal aid clinic. Besides, my signature is on the original escrow authorization. If I speak up, they will use my own name to make me an accomplice." I closed my eyes and listened to the tape hiss. Helen had recognized the corruption, but she had chosen to wait. She wanted to gather more evidence, protect the legitimate charity work, and avoid personal ruin. Rachel had used that exact same logic. My daughter had stayed silent to protect her reputation, hoping to fix the problem from the inside without blowing up her entire life. A tragic generational cycle of silence had allowed Constance to build an empire of stolen homes. My cell phone chimed on the granite counter. A news alert flashed across the bright screen. The Home Again Foundation had just released a massive public relations statement to multiple media outlets. The press release proudly announced a new scholarship fund named in honor of their brilliant co-founder, Helen Hale. Constance was publicly weaponizing my dead wife's legacy to force me into submission. I looked at the ancient audio recorder, then at the forged donation pledge sitting inside Maya's plastic evidence sleeve. Helen had not stolen anyone's home. But the first door in Constance's machine had opened with my wife's signature. The morning news broadcast carried the smooth voice of the local anchor, detailing the charitable contributions of the foundation. A glossy photograph of Helen filled the screen, accompanied by glowing praise from Constance Cross. The foundation had successfully painted my late wife as the visionary co-founder of their housing rescue model. The public relations machine was working with terrifying efficiency. Every digital channel and local newspaper framed my defense as the bitter outburst of a grieving widower trying to strip resources away from vulnerable families. My corporate phone rang constantly. Hale Restoration lost another major municipal landscaping contract before noon. Hale knew the market would abandon a business tied to an ongoing scandal, but the financial loss felt distant compared to the crumbling ground beneath my family. The media assault designed to destroy Helen's reputation served a much darker purpose. Constance wanted to isolate me completely, ensuring that any future testimony from my side would be dismissed as a malicious retaliation born out of personal spite. A sharp rap on the front door interrupted my thoughts. I walked down the hallway and pulled the heavy wood open. Nora Price stood on the slate porch, her hands trembling inside the pockets of her worn coat. She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the foyer, her dark eyes wide with unmasked panic. "I cannot do this anymore," Nora said, her voice cracking as she leaned against the wall for support. "A man stopped me outside the grocery store this morning. He handed me an envelope containing photographs of my grandchildren walking home from school." My chest tightened into a hard knot. "Did they threaten your family?" "They offered me money," Nora whispered, staring down at the polished wooden floor. $10,000 in cash, plus a signed non-disclosure agreement. They told me to sign a paper stating I fully understood my home transfer and that you forced me to lie about the foundation. I stepped closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "Did you sign it?" Nora shook her head rapidly. "Not yet. But my grandchildren live in that neighborhood, Raymond. I have to protect them." I walked her to the kitchen, poured a warm cup of coffee, and promised her that Maya Brooks would immediately dispatch a private security detail to watch her apartment complex. I did not pressure her to keep her promise of testifying. Watching her walk out the back door into the gray afternoon fog left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had dragged an innocent woman back into a war she never wanted to fight, and now the enemy was using her family as leverage. The security system alert chimed at midnight, dragging me out of a restless sleep. I sat up in bed, staring at the flashing monitor on my bedside table. The motion sensors on the northern perimeter had triggered a warning. A few seconds later, a dull thud echoed from the detached metal building near the edge of our property, where we stored old architectural archives and backup paper records. I pulled on a heavy canvas jacket, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the utility closet, and walked out into the chilling rain. The wind whipped through the oak trees, sending wet leaves skittering across the stone patio. When I reached the storage annex, the heavy side door hung slightly ajar. A thin plume of gray smoke curled out from the dark interior frame, carrying the sharp, chemical stench of burning paper. Inside the small room, an automated fire suppression sprinkler system had already activated, hissing a steady stream of water over a row of metal shelving units. A black canvas backpack lay abandoned on the concrete floor near a puddle of water. Inside the partially melted plastic bins, decades of historical project files were soaked through. The local fire marshal arrived 30 minutes later, joined by 2 patrol deputies. They sifted through the ruined cardboard boxes, pointing their high-intensity beams at the charred remains of our backup archives. This was intentional, the lead investigator stated, pulling off his soot-stained work gloves. Someone used an accelerant near the base of the secondary shelving unit. Fortunately, the sprinkler system caught it before the entire building went up. Maya Brooks arrived before the police tape came down. She walked through the wet doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the damage with clinical precision. She crouched down beside the melted plastic bins and picked up a damp remnant of a file folder. They were not looking for general architectural blueprints, Maya said, standing up and brushing water from her tailored trousers. The digital access logs from our office server show that someone attempted to breach our secure cloud drive at the exact same hour this fire was set. They failed to bypass our firewall, so they sent someone here to destroy the physical backup files. I looked at the charred shelves where Helen's earliest handwritten site notes had been stored for 20 years. Did they get everything? No, the attorney replied, holding up a heavy plastic evidence bag she had salvaged from the lower filing drawer. The binder containing the original beneficial ownership records for the primary shell companies was stored in the bottom waterproof vault. It is safe. Before dawn broke, my phone chimed with a private message. The sender ID was blocked. The text contained a single digital photograph showing my daughter Rachel sitting inside a parked car at a rest stop 20 miles outside town. Below the image sat a short warning. Tell your daughter to stop talking to federal investigators, or the next fire will not be contained to a shed. Panic overrode my caution. I dialed Rachel's personal cell phone number immediately. The line rang 6 times before a tired, shaking voice answered. "Dad," she whispered, her words muffled by the sound of rushing highway traffic. "Where are you?" I demanded, gripping the phone so hard my fingers ached. "Are you safe?" "I drove out of the city," Rachel said, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. Adrian tracked my laptop location. He waited for me in the underground parking garage beneath my apartment. He told me that if I cooperate with the state attorney general, my name will be placed at the top of the criminal indictment list, right beside his mother's. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, trying to steady my own voice. "Do not go back to your apartment. Drive straight to Maya's office. She has security waiting there right now." "I cannot do that," Rachel sobbed softly into the receiver. "Adrian has copies of the false corporate filings with my signature on them. He has professional witnesses who will swear in court that I acted alone. I am going to prison, Dad. My entire life is over. If you run now, you make yourself look guilty of everything," I told her, fighting the urge to beg her to come home. "You have to choose right now. Do you want to spend the rest of your life running from a shadow, or do you want to help us tear their machine apart?" The line went completely dead. A mechanical dial tone buzzed in my ear. The financial reality of the case closed in, like a tightening vice, during a strategic conference in Maya's office later that afternoon. Leo Martin laid out a complex timeline on the glass conference table. The shell companies tied to the foundation were aggressively preparing to execute a rapid commercial refinance across 3 major residential properties within the next 7 days. If they successfully execute this refinance, Leo explained, tapping his red pen against the spreadsheet, the stolen equity will be broken down into dozens of smaller wire transfers and funneled through offshore accounts before the end of the month. Once that money crosses international borders, recovering restitution for Nora and the other families becomes practically impossible. "We need the federal regulators to step in immediately," I said. "We cannot wait for a civil trial." "The regulators have enough circumstantial patterns to request search warrants," Maya admitted, leaning back in her leather chair. but they are hesitant to move without a primary insider willing to testify under oath about Constance's direct involvement in the approval matrix. Adrian can easily claim he acted independently, and Constance will claim her son abused her charity's name behind her back. The legal puzzle lacked a single, immovable anchor. We had the money trail, the forged signatures, the manipulated security footage, and the victims. But without someone placing the ultimate control directly into Constance's hands, the architecture of the fraud remained legally protected by corporate smoke and mirrors. The storm clouds returned just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging Linden House into deep, heavy shadows. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, staring at the polished granite island. The fake donor pledge rested inside Maya's plastic sleeve on one side. On the other side sat the heavy brass keyring with the knotted blue thread. My phone buzzed against the stone surface. It was an encrypted notification from Rachel. The message contained a single digital audio file and a short text string. Play the file. It is the board meeting recording Constance tried to delete from the cloud server. I plugged my headphones into the phone and pressed play. The audio quality was exceptional, capturing the crisp, authoritative tones of Constance Cross, speaking directly to her son and corporate counsel during a closed-door executive session held 6 months before the wedding. Make sure every single closing document routes directly through Rachel's operational account, Constance's voice commanded through the speakers, cold and completely devoid of maternal warmth. Adrian's name must stay entirely off the deed packages. If any regulatory questions arise regarding the asset transfers, the girl's electronic signature will serve as our primary firewall. She takes the legal exposure, and the foundation survives. The recorded proof was absolute. Constance had meticulously engineered the entire scheme, using my daughter as a human shield, while she plundered homes from desperate families. My phone rang instantly with an incoming call from Maya. The attorney did not waste time with formal greetings. "Raymond," Maya said, her voice sharp with urgent energy. "The state investigator just called me. Based on the financial ledgers Leo provided and this new audio file, the federal prosecutor has officially signed off on the emergency search warrants and the asset freeze injunction. They are moving on the foundation offices at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark, quiet driveway where my truck sat parked in the rain. "What about the refinance scheduled for next week?" "It is dead," Maya answered firmly. "The emergency injunction will lock every corporate account associated with Blue Winter Holdings before the sun comes up." "And Rachel?" I asked, holding my breath. "She called my office 10 minutes ago," the lawyer said quietly. "She is sitting in the waiting room right now. She wants to surrender her devices and give a full, unvarnished statement to the authorities." The heavy burden that had crushed my chest for months eased just a fraction. But the relief was tempered by a cold, hard truth. My daughter had finally chosen to step out of the shadows, but she was walking straight into the fire she helped build. The clock on the wall ticked forward into the deep hours of the night. If I handed over the complete file to the regulatory authorities, my only child would face severe criminal charges for her silence and her forged signatures. If I held the package back to protect her, a dozen displaced families like Nora Price would never see their stolen homes or their dignity restored. At sunrise, the federal investigator was scheduled to arrive at Maya's office, waiting for my final answer. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Maya Brooks's downtown conference room, casting long geometric shadows across the polished glass table. I sat near the head of the room, holding the heavy manila folder containing every certified document, verified audit log, and forensic backup drive we had managed to salvage. The choice I had wrestled with through the dark hours of the storm finally crystallized into absolute clarity. Love for a child does not mean shielding her from the consequences of her own choices. If I kept these records hidden to protect my daughter from prison, I would be standing shoulder to shoulder with Constance Cross, erasing the dignity of every family they had destroyed. I slid the comprehensive evidence package across the desk toward the state investigator. He opened the cover, flipped through the master ledger provided by Calvin Reed, and studied the email trail containing Constance's explicit instructions. "This chain of custody is pristine," the investigator said, looking up from the papers. He did not offer any false comfort or legal guarantees regarding my daughter. He simply closed the folder, secured the clasps, and stood up from his chair. "We have what we need," for the search warrants and the asset freeze injunction. The operation begins this morning. Leaving the lawyer's office, I drove straight to a small community center on the edge of town where Nora Price and 3 other displaced homeowners had agreed to meet. I did not send Maya to speak for me, and I did not call them on the telephone. I walked into the modest room, carrying a cardboard box filled with copies of our compiled timelines and public property records. Nora sat at a folding table near the back, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her coat. The other families looked at me with deep suspicion, expecting another smooth-talking representative from an organization that promised safety while stealing their foundation. I am not here to make excuses, I told them, standing by the front of the room without a podium or a script. The foundation used my late wife's name to build trust, and they used my daughter's signature to lock the doors behind you. I handed the complete package over to the state authorities this morning. That package includes every document, every email, and every name involved, including my own daughter's. The silence in the room was absolute. Nora stared at my face, searching for any sign of deception or calculation. Slowly, the defensive tension in her posture melted away. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a thick envelope containing the unsigned non-disclosure agreement and the threatening photographs left by Constance's operatives, and laid them gently on the table. "We want our homes back," Nora said, her voice steady and clear, "or at least the truth told in an open courtroom where everyone can see it. You will have both, I promised." Later that afternoon, Calvin Reed made contact through an encrypted messaging channel, terrified of the corporate blowback but equally terrified of being indicted as the sole bookkeeper for a criminal enterprise. The former accountant agreed to meet us in the dim parking garage of a suburban public library. He stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, clutching a small encrypted storage drive in his sweaty palm. "Constance never put her name on any of the corporate deeds," Calvin explained, his breath pluming in the cold air. "She used an internal approval matrix called the 7 Code. No commercial refinance or asset transfer above $50,000 could move forward without her explicit digital authorization." He handed the flash drive to Leo Martin, who immediately plugged it into a ruggedized field laptop. The screen illuminated a massive, interconnected web of corporate accounts, detailing how millions of dollars in stolen equity flowed directly out of foundation, escrow accounts, and into private real estate holdings controlled by Adrian. "This matrix is the master key," Leo said, his eyes wide as he scrolled through the encrypted transaction logs. "It completely connects Constance to every single fraudulent closing package." Earlier that morning, Rachel's independent family law attorney had filed her divorce petition and requested temporary financial restraining orders. The orders were designed to block Adrian from draining their joint accounts, transferring marital property, or hiding assets that might later be subject to forfeiture or restitution. After the filing was confirmed, Rachel arrived at Maya's office to surrender her personal electronics and hardware keys. She sat across from the attorney, pale and exhausted, but she did not ask for a special deal or demand that we conceal her involvement. "Adrian is already scrubbing his home servers," Rachel told us, her voice hollow as she slid her cracked smartphone onto the desk. "He thinks he can burn the digital evidence before the warrants are served. He told me this morning that if the foundation goes down, he will make sure I take the full criminal blame as a rogue employee." "Your cooperation changes how the prosecutor views your role," Maya noted, taking detailed notes on her legal pad. "It does not grant you immunity from the false filings, but it demonstrates immediate remorse and active assistance." "I do not want immunity," Rachel whispered, looking down at her hands. "I just want the lying to stop." With the financial ledgers authenticated, the victim testimonies organized, and the regulatory authorities fully briefed, we turned our focus to the final strategic phase. Home Again Foundation had scheduled a major emergency donor gala at Greyhaven Estate, framing the event as a celebration of transparency and a formal ceremony to accept Linden House into their charitable portfolio. Constance and Adrian planned to use the glittering stage to cement their public narrative, present me as a bitter and abusive father, and pressure the remaining board members into approving the massive multi-property refinance before the end of the week. Under the nonprofit organization bylaws, a coalition of major donors and independent directors possessed the legal authority to demand an emergency board hearing if there was credible evidence of related party transactions threatening charitable assets. We did not need to launch a secret ambush. We simply delivered the comprehensive forensic audit and the victim affidavits directly to the neutral board members 48 hours before the gala doors opened. The independent directors reviewed the evidence in stunned silence. Acting under the Foundation bylaws, they issued formal notice that an emergency investigative hearing would follow the public opening of the donor gala. Constance, Adrian, their counsel, the regulators, and every voting director received the revised agenda 48 hours in advance. Constance could still deliver her prepared remarks, but she could no longer prevent the board from examining the related party transactions on the record. The directors also opened the hearing to regulators, media representatives, and the displaced families whose homes appeared in the audit. The evening before the hearing, I drove out to Greyhaven Estate alone. The grand ballroom was completely empty, echoing with a hollow, sterile silence. I walked across the polished marble floor to the exact spot where Adrian had demanded the keys and struck my face months ago. The bruised tissue had healed long ago, but the memory of that public humiliation remained etched into the stone. Nora and the other displaced homeowners walked through the side service entrance, their footsteps clicking softly against the floor. They did not look like broken victims anymore. They walked with a quiet, unyielding resolve, taking their seats in the front row where the wealthy donors usually sat. Rachel arrived shortly afterward, escorted by her independent family law counsel. She walked down the center aisle and took a seat near the back, refusing to hide behind her father or seek shelter from the coming storm. I pulled the heavy brass keyring from my pocket. I did not carry the real keys to Linden House tonight. Instead, I placed the ceremonial silver prop key with the Foundation logo onto the empty mahogany podium, leaving the knotted blue thread tied tightly around the metal ring. Maya walked up beside me, resting her hand briefly on my shoulder. "Tomorrow, they will step onto this stage expecting you to hand over your home," she said quietly. "Let them try," I answered, looking out across the empty rows of chairs where the people they had erased were finally sitting in the position of judgment. "We are going to make them explain every single house they took." The crystal chandeliers of Greyhaven Estate burned with a brilliant, unforgiving light across the packed auditorium. 215 guests filled the crimson velvet seats, though the familiar donors and local elites looked distinctly uneasy tonight. The event had been billed as a celebration of corporate generosity, but the whispers traveling through the rows spoke of an entirely different kind of reckoning. Constance Cross stepped up to the mahogany podium with her signature grace. A tailored ivory suit hugged her frame, and her silver hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect chignon. She offered the crowd a warm, practiced smile that reached her eyes without a single trace of genuine warmth. "Tonight, we gather to honor the sacred trust of giving," Constance began, her rich, modulated voice filling the room through the overhead speakers. "For years, the Home Again Foundation has protected families from the bitter cold of displacement. We have faced baseless rumors and malicious attacks from those who fear transparency. But truth always prevails." Adrian Cross sat directly behind her on the elevated stage, wearing a dark navy blazer and a carefully cultivated expression of dignified suffering. He leaned forward into the microphone as his mother gestured toward the side aisle. "We invite Raymond Hale to join us on this stage," Constance announced, her voice rising with theatrical magnanimity. "Let us put aside the anger and finalize the legacy he so generously promised to the children of our community." The spotlight swung around, locking onto my face in the fourth row. Every head turned in unison, waiting to see if I would march forward and surrender. I did not rush. I stood up slowly, smoothed the lapels of my dark jacket, and walked down the center aisle. Instead of climbing the wooden stairs to the platform, I stopped right at the base of the steps, folding my hands over the back of an empty chair. "I will consider any donation to this foundation only after the board answers 3 simple questions regarding the residential properties transferred through your corporate affiliates," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the dead silence of the hall. Constance faltered for a fraction of a second, her professional composure twitching at the edges. "This is a charity gala, Raymond, not a courtroom." Independent board counsel stood up from the front row, holding a heavy stack of certified papers. "The board has voted to convert this gathering into an official investigative hearing," counsel announced to the stunned audience. "We will now examine the property management records." Nora Price, was the first witness called to the microphone. She walked up the side stairs with quiet dignity, looking down at the packed rows of wealthy patrons who had funded the charity without ever knowing its true cost. Nora spoke clearly, recounting how the foundation promised to protect her family before forcing her out of her home with fraudulent paperwork. When Nora finished, Leo Martin stepped forward to present the financial architecture. He did not rely on emotional speeches. He directed the AV crew to project the master ledger and corporate ownership maps onto the massive dual screens flanking the stage. The glowing diagrams laid out the sprawling network of shell companies, tracking how 12 distinct residential properties were systematically stripped of their equity and funneled into private real estate accounts. These transactions did not occur through administrative error, Leo explained, pointing his laser pointer at the scrolling data streams. Every single title transfer required explicit digital authorization through an internal approval protocol. Adrian jumped to his feet, slamming his palm onto the podium. This is an outrageous fabrication by a bitter old man who wanted to block his daughter's marriage, he shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. Rachel managed the program records. If there were errors in the intake files, she was the one who processed them. The harsh spotlights shifted instantly toward the back corner of the auditorium. Rachel sat in the final row, isolated and completely exposed under the glare. She did not shrink away from the gaze of 200 people. She stood up, straightened her shoulders, and walked down the center aisle until she reached the base of the stage, stopping just feet away from her husband. I processed the files because Adrian told me the foundation was holding temporary trust holds for families in crisis, Rachel said, her voice steady and remarkably clear. He brought me the closing documents after they were drafted by corporate counsel. When I started asking questions about the missing deeds, he threatened to destroy my family. Adrian sneered, leaning over the edge of the stage. You signed your name to every single transfer, Rachel. You uploaded the forged donor pledge from your own laptop. You are just as guilty as anyone in this room. Yes, I signed them, Rachel admitted, and the brutal honesty of her confession silenced the entire hall. And I gave the passcodes because you trapped me in the dressing room and held my phone while you forced me to read the authentication numbers out loud. Forensic data technicians immediately projected the electronic signature audit trail onto the main screen. The timestamp logs matched Rachel's testimony down to the exact second, displaying the device access records and the multi-factor authentication ping originating from the private bridal suite, while Adrian stood guard outside the door. Constance stepped forward, pushing her son back from the microphone with a sharp, imperious gesture. Her face had turned pale, but her voice remained chillingly cold. The girl is fabricating a hysterical narrative to cover her own corporate theft. The foundation has zero tolerance for rogue employees who exploit our good name. There was no rogue employee, Constance, the board's forensic examiner said from the side of the stage. He approached the podium carrying a sealed evidence drive. He explained that the audio Rachel had surrendered was not an informal secret recording. It was a deleted copy of an official executive meeting file recovered from the Foundation's cloud archive. Its digital hash matched the server audit logs, and the timestamps showed that Constance's administrator account had attempted to erase it after the wedding. Board counsel authorized the audio to be played. Make sure every single closing document routes directly through Rachel's operational account, Constance's recorded voice commanded through the auditorium speakers. Adrian's name must stay entirely off the deed packages. If any regulatory questions arise regarding the asset transfers, the girl's electronic signature will serve as our primary firewall. She takes the legal exposure, and the foundation survives. The examiner stopped the recording and confirmed that no cuts or alterations had been detected. Then Daniel Ortiz stepped forward with a separate evidence drive. I did not record that board meeting, he said. My responsibility was the wedding. Raymond Hale's contract gave my company control of the original multi-track files, and the foundation had no authority to take or delete them. The screens displayed the complete wedding footage. Adrian lunged for the keys and struck me before I moved toward him. A backstage audio channel captured his order to security 11 days after the removal plan had been drafted. If he refuses, remove him before he turns this into a scene. A second channel captured Constance immediately after the slap. Get the keys. The girl can take the fall tomorrow. That was the real power of the contract carrying my name. It had not given me ownership of the wedding or the right to invent evidence. It had ensured that the people who staged my humiliation could not erase the original record after their edited version went public. The two independent evidence chains now pointed toward the same design. The cloud archive showed how Constance built the financial firewall around Rachel. The wedding files showed how Adrian and his mother tried to enforce it in public. Constance gripped the edge of the podium until her fingers turned bone white. For the first time, the expression on her face was not charity, dignity, or concern. It was fear. Adrian looked wildly around the room, realizing that his mother had explicitly named him as the beneficiary while setting him up to share the criminal liability. He turned on her with sudden, venomous fury. "You ran the approval matrix," Adrian screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at the woman who gave him life. "You designed the corporate structure. You told me the lawyers made it bulletproof. Shut your fool mouth," Constance hissed back, her polished composure completely evaporating as decades of calculated deceit collapsed in a matter of seconds. The independent board members did not wait for a formal debate. The chairman stood up from his seat, his face grim with professional disgust. The board moves to immediately suspend Constance Cross and Adrian Cross from all executive duties, revoking their operational access and stripping them of any fiduciary authority within the organization. A chorus of immediate seconds echoed across the panel, followed by a unanimous vote in favor of the suspension. Almost simultaneously, the heavy glass double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. Several state investigators and local law enforcement officers walked purposefully down the center aisle, their badges catching the glare of the stage lights. They bypassed the gasping donors and walked straight up the wooden steps. Adrian tried to turn and bolt through the service exit behind the stage, but two officers cut off his path instantly, pressing him firmly against the wall and snapping steel handcuffs around his wrists. He cursed loudly, shouting threats at the prosecutors as they read him his federal rights. Constance did not resist. She stood motionless behind the podium, her head held high out of sheer, unyielding arrogance, even as the investigators handed her a formal search warrant and instructed her to surrender her electronic devices immediately. Nora Price did not cheer, and the other displaced families did not applaud. They simply watched in quiet, profound vindication as the people who had erased their lives were finally removed from power. I stood near the front row, watching the dramatic scene unfold under the blinding stage lights. Maya walked up beside me, holding a tablet displaying a fresh notification from the civil court clerk. "The emergency injunction has been formally approved," Maya whispered in my ear. "All foundation accounts are frozen, and the scheduled commercial refinances have been permanently blocked." I nodded slowly, letting out a long breath that felt like it had been trapped in my chest since the day of the wedding. Rachel walked down the center aisle, stopping a few feet away from where I stood. She looked exhausted, smaller than she had in months, but the defiant terror in her eyes was completely gone. State investigators flanked her on both sides. A senior prosecutor stepped forward, holding a formal charging document. He looked down at my daughter with an expression of professional pity, but his words carried the weight of the law. "Your cooperation has been officially noted for the sentencing record, Rachel," the prosecutor said, his voice measured and solemn. "It will serve as a substantial mitigating factor before a federal judge, but it does not erase the fraudulent documents bearing your signature, nor does it undo the financial losses suffered by the homeowners." The officer handed her a copy of the criminal information filing. Her name was listed right alongside her husband's and her mother-in-law's. The third name on the document was Rachel Hale. My daughter looked across the open space, locking her gaze onto mine. The realization of what was coming hit her with full force, and her lower lip quivered slightly before she bit down hard to regain her composure. "Did you know this would happen when you handed the files to the investigators, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the departing crowd. "I knew the truth had to include everyone who touched the machine," I answered, keeping my tone steady and gentle, refusing to offer her a comforting lie. Even the people who stood inside it while the doors were locked. Rachel did not cry out, and she did not run away. She gave a slow, solemn nod of acceptance, turned her shoulders away from the empty stage, and walked out the side doors alongside her legal counsel, finally taking full ownership of her path. The legal process did not end with the dramatic applause or the flashing cameras inside the Greyhaven Auditorium. Justice moved slowly, measured out in endless court depositions, forensic audits, and quiet negotiations behind closed doors. Over the next 18 months, federal search warrants uncovered hidden bank accounts, private offshore servers, and detailed property manifests that dismantled the Home Again Foundation piece by piece. The federal district court judge appointed an independent receiver to inventory the remaining assets, separate legitimate charitable contributions from illicit real estate proceeds, and determine which displaced homeowners could legally reclaim their original property titles. Adrian faced a multi-count federal indictment, charging him with conspiracy to commit wire and bank fraud, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and felony assault. During his federal sentencing hearing, the disgraced groom attempted to shift the entire burden of guilt onto his mother, sobbing to the magistrate about a lifetime of psychological control and manipulation. The prosecutor countered with a devastating presentation of Adrian's personal media empire clips, luxury car purchases, and threatening text messages sent to Nora Price and my daughter. The federal judge remained entirely unimpressed by the theatrical display of remorse. Adrian received a sentence of 14 years in federal prison, followed by mandatory restitution, full asset forfeiture, and a permanent lifetime ban from managing any nonprofit charity or holding fiduciary power over another person's estate. Constance fared no better when her case reached the sentencing docket weeks later. The grand matriarch maintained her icy composure until the final moment, continuing to insist that her housing model had saved thousands of families from financial ruin. The master ledger entries, the digital approval matrix codes, and the explicit operational memos dismantled her defense completely. The donor board stripped her name from every plaque, building, and archive associated with the organization. The judge handed down a sentence of 11 years in federal prison, ordering her to surrender her massive personal estate to establish a specialized restitution fund for the victims. The people she had privately dismissed as weak, uneducated, and easily silenced had stood together as an unyielding wall, crushing her empire from the ground up. Rachel's legal reckoning arrived through a separate plea agreement coordinated by her independent defense counsel. Throughout the months leading up to her sentencing, her own private family law attorney successfully finalized her bitter divorce from Adrian, utilizing temporary financial restraining orders to freeze their marital assets and block her husband from hiding any shared wealth away from the federal restitution pool. When she finally stood before the federal magistrate to enter her formal guilty plea for participation in a fraudulent property filing, the courtroom gallery fell completely silent. The prosecutor acknowledged her extensive cooperation and the early surrender of her personal devices, but he made sure the court understood why leniency had strict boundaries. Her genuine cooperation and the crushing psychological control she endured were substantial mitigating factors that significantly reduced her prison exposure. But those elements could not wipe away the hard reality of her actions. Her actual signature and the multi-factor authentication codes she provided had finalized the illegal transfer that stripped Nora Price of her home, and because that property had already been sold to an innocent third-party buyer, the resulting damage could never be fully reversed. The federal judge sentenced her to 18 months of incarceration in a minimum security federal facility, followed by a strict term of supervised release, mandatory financial restitution, and a multi-year ban from handling corporate accounts or legal documents. I paid for her independent defense counsel to ensure she received a fair and thorough legal representation, but I refused to pay a single penny of her court-ordered restitution, and I amended my estate documents to remove her from any direct inheritance or future fiduciary control. Love must maintain healthy boundaries, and true affection means refusing to shield a grown adult from the righteous weight of her own choices. The physical structure of Linden House remained standing through it all, weathering the storms of public scandal and legal scrutiny. Once the federal asset freeze lifted and the civil claims were fully resolved, I opened Helen's old leather-bound recipe book one final time. I copied every single index project code and cross-reference note into a comprehensive preservation log, handing the original historical records over to the State Restitution Archive while keeping clean family copies locked safely inside my office. I invited Nora Price to the house for a quiet afternoon tea in the garden. She shared the news that her federal restitution payout, combined with assistance from the newly restructured community fund, had allowed her to purchase a modest, secure condominium just a few blocks away from her grandchildren. She never fully recovered the exact memories of her old porch, but she owned her front door again, free from fear and free from fraudulent debt. Instead of dissolving Linden House or handing it over to another untested charity prone to corruption, I restructured the massive property with the help of Maya Brooks and Leo Martin. We converted the spacious ground floor into an independent community legal clinic designed specifically to protect vulnerable homeowners from predatory real estate schemes. Hail Restoration provided the physical maintenance and structural inspection expertise. Maya's firm organized free legal seminars to teach families how to read title deeds and mortgage liens, and Leo established a transparent financial oversight board. Nora joined the advisory committee as a permanent victims representative, ensuring that no homeowner would ever be ignored or dismissed the way she had been. The grand stone house that Adrian had tried to steal as a public trophy transformed into a fortress of accountability, teaching ordinary people how to recognize the dangerous warning signs of corporate greed before signing their names away. The spring air carried the fresh scent of blooming jasmine across the slate driveway when Rachel finally returned to Linden House. She had completed her 18-month term of incarceration and stepped directly into her initial phase of supervised release. She arrived unannounced late in the afternoon, walking slowly up the front steps without a single piece of luggage in her hands. She did not reach into her coat, and she did not pull out the old brass prop key with the foundation logo. Instead, she set a small weathered cardboard box down on the wooden bench by the front door. Inside sat the knotted blue thread she had tied in the bridal suite, alongside the returned metal souvenir from a wedding that had destroyed our family's illusions. I opened the heavy wooden door, looking out at my daughter through the open threshold. She looked tired, her hair cut shorter than I remembered, wearing simple, unpretentious clothes that belonged to someone working hard to earn an honest living at an ordinary job. She did not ask to move back into her old bedroom. She did not ask for financial assistance, and she did not offer any excuses for the past. She simply looked me in the eyes and told me about her new job, working at a local community library downtown, helping elderly patrons organize their tax documents and public utility forms. I did not hand her the real keys to Linden House that morning. I did not offer her a triumphant welcome home or invite her to reclaim her old position of privilege within my corporate life. I simply stepped back, opened the heavy door wide with my own hand, and invited her inside for a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. For the first time in our lives, neither of us mistook parental affection for proprietary control. Across the granite island, where the fake donation pledge had once rested, we sat down as two flawed human beings willing to speak the unvarnished truth. Outside the large bay window, a young family stood on the front lawn, patiently listening to a legal clinic volunteer explain the fine print of a standard property document before putting pen to paper. I watched the mother pause, ask a careful question, and take all the time she needed to read every single line. I did not find the delay frustrating. I found it liberating, knowing that the doors of this house were finally open to protect people rather than lock them away. When you close the door on a difficult chapter of life, you realize that true protection does not come from locking people out or handing over the keys to your world under pressure. You learn that love cannot be measured by how much property you sacrifice to keep the peace, nor can it be proven by silencing your own judgment to cover up someone else's mistakes. When you choose to look the other way while someone you raise steps across the line of integrity, you are not saving them from a fall. You are only postponing a reckoning that grows heavier with every passing day. Real strength means standing firm when the demands get loud, refusing to let guilt dictate your boundaries, and accepting that you cannot rescue anyone who refuses to carry the weight of their own choices. You must remember that your home, your name, and your peace of mind are not currency to be spent on smoothing over family betrayals. If you have spent years apologizing for behavior that crossed the line, or if you have carried the burden of secrets that were never yours to keep, ask yourself this: how much of your own life have you surrendered just to keep a fragile illusion of family harmony intact? And what would happen if you finally decided to draw a line that no one could cross?